You, me, and HIFMB. Stories of Science and the Sea.
Hello everybody and welcome to the next episode of the HIFMB podcast. In this one I talked to Lucie Kuczynski, one of our fine postdocs, who among various other projects is currently in the midst of publishing a really interesting project on extinction debt, and with that we go into why certain targets for biodiversity management might not be ideal, talk about her life through academia and why La Rochelle is the best city of the world. Then about French wine, obviously. We also talk about, at the very end, about why academics tend to get stuck in academia, but why academia might not be the only option for us academics. So definitely stick around until the end. There's a whole lot of valuable information in this and thoughts that need to be discussed a bit. That's why we decided to make this a 1-hour episode. So without further ado, I give you Lucie. Hello and welcome everybody to the next episode of the HIFMB podcast. And today I have Lucie Kuczynski. Kuczynski, damn it. From France, that's why that's hard.
It's actually a Polish name.
It's a Polish name, but that's not how Polish would say it, right?
No, actually the Polish would say it like the German.
Yeah.
So like usually here people say it the proper way,
Okay.
but that's not how I grew up. Like when I grew up, we would say it Kuczynski.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a little bit confusing when I arrived here. Anyway.
Welcome, Lucie. So you are a community ecologist?
I am a community ecologist.
Yes.
At the ICBM, not at the HIFMB.
Exactly. So this is a novel thing. Lucie is actually, she works at HIFMB physically? Like you have an office here, right?
I do have an office here, and it started first because I was commuting here to get German classes.
Yeah.
Which eventually I didn't go through with, but not the point. And so I asked Helmut if I could have an office here because it would be more convenient to meet up with him.
Yeah.
Because I'm in his working group in this Dynacom project, but I'm actually ICBM. So yeah.
Helmut Hillebrand, our institute leader. Okay. And what do you, ICBM, that stands for the institute.
Institute of, so it's in German, but it's Institute of Chemistry and Marine Biology.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. Exactly.
Biologie des Meeres.
Yeah.
So
what we both are technically employed in, as a.
Oh, so you're actually not HIFMB, are you?
I am. I am employed. I work at HIFMB and am employed through the uni. So university, and the Institute of the Chemistry and Marine Biology. Yeah. All right. Okay. And what does your work involve here? What's your?
So I'm a postdoc in the Dynacom project, which is a research unit funded by the DFG.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're in the second phase of it. And
DFG is the Deutsche Forschungsgesellschaft, so the German research association.
Yeah, it's like exactly. It's like basically they're funding research. But and so we are in the second phase now. The first phase was understanding diversity, mostly in the Frisian island, like Spiekeroog and Oudenijn and others. And so understanding diversity both in the terrestrial part of the system of the island, but also so plants and like macroinvertebrates and but also more on the marine side of the system. So really where you have like the tide like coming and this interface between like the two systems. So really trying to link those two and having common measure. How do you compare plants and birds when it comes to traits, like two different attributes? Because you can describe a bird with its wings, but probably not a plant, right? And the plant is more about like the maybe some chemical reaction, like the photosynthesis. But obviously a bird is not doing it, and so it's how do you find those common features to be able to compare them and say that's how this system responds to stress or to whatever using those traits. So that was the first phase. And now we're in the second phase, which is...
How long was the first phase?
So it's like one of the last DFG research unit that worked like that, but the first phase was 3 years. So you get like PhD students getting a lot of samples and so on.
Right.
The second year is also 3 years. And then you have a third phase, which is 2 years, where it's you're not getting new data, but you're putting everything together. It's like really like the big synthesis part of the project. But so basically research units from the DFG, and I think that's true for all of them, but I'm not sure, are 8 year long. So it's usually like pretty big project.
Yeah.
And so actually in the Dynacom, they also have like those artificial islands. So if you go to Spiekeroog, you have like those 12 islands. So now the setup changed a little bit, and especially there were storms and so.
Yeah, didn't they lose one?
I think we lost two.
Two. Oh.
I don't know if it was 2 or 3, but we did.
Yeah. I saw them on Spiekeroog once. Helmut showed them to me.
No, and it was like, I remember when I applied to this project, it was like, they just build islands.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh, okay, my bad. It was really, really impressive. So yeah, that's the Dynacom.
Yeah.
Or is it the BIFMate, actually?
Yeah, just for visualization. So they're like, how big are they? Like 6 meters long?
And maybe like 2 or 3 meters wide.
Yeah.
And then you have like different levels of elevation that are actually reflecting the elevation you have a little bit more inland. And so you have like different stress level when it comes to tide and like to the water level, basically. So yeah.
Yeah, they're really cool. If you're ever on Spiekeroog, check it out.
Yeah. I don't know if you can go if you don't have an authorization to go there.
Okay.
Like that's what I was wondering.
Yeah. Okay.
If you're in Spiekeroog, actually don't go. But you can actually see them from Google Maps, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like tiny points, but you can definitely see them, which I feel like it's like and I probably from Google Earth too. I don't know. I don't have Google Earth, but yeah.
It's like the Chinese wall. You can see it from space.
Yeah. Well, maybe not from space.
No.
But yeah, and so the second phase is a little bit more about understanding the effect of disturbances. So, heat waves and storms. And so how does that affect those different systems? So that's the... sorry. The overall goal of Dynacom, but also really having this functional perspective into it. So having species traits, because not all species are the same. And so, but again, how do you compare, a mite, a bird, and a plant?
Yeah.
Which it's not that straightforward.
Yeah.
We actually got our retreat, and it was always like, well, yeah, no, it's definitely not that easy. What are those traits? So like coming with dimensions that make sense.
I was gonna say,
like, for instance, how does a species move through space? Which for plants, it would be related to the seeds mostly, or to the fact they're actually using animals to disperse. But then you still have this common thing that all species, in some extent, do. They do disperse or move. They do have to deal with their environment. So a very common one is the thermal niche, right? Which is true for, you can be an ectotherm, which means you don't regulate, right, like your temperature, your internal temperature, but you can also be an endotherm, and then you still have like a niche and a thermal niche. So you have like those, some dimensions are actually comparable through different taxonomic groups. So that's like also one of the go. And then also the interactions between species. So regardless of what you are species-wise, either someone is trying to eat you or you're trying to eat someone, or both, right? And so you always have those trophic interactions, also competition between species. And so you can kind of start to compare things based on that. But that's definitely one of the big challenge, and putting that really also in the traffic context, right? So really having the who's hitting whom idea, and how is it impacted by disturbances, and is it the same in the terrestrial system or the marine system, and what's the stability of the entire system and the resilience. So it's a really, really dense project, I would say.
Oh,
basically.
definitely, yes.
But it's also why there are 10 sub-projects, right? So it's not one person dealing with all of that. It's definitely like a big teamwork.
And you have been involved in it for how long?
So I arrived in the middle of the first phase. So I guess it was like a year and a half, a little bit, something like that.
Yeah.
And then I've
2020.
2020, and we are almost in 2023. Yeah, and
yes.
So it's been so was it 2 years? I don't know, 2020, and we started the second phase this year.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. Well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
and one of the papers that caught my attention, why I thought you'd be cool to interview here, was something on extinction debt. Yeah. That is not related to Dynacom though, right?
So no. Actually, it wasn't. It's been a project I have in my mind since my PhD, which was about how diversity is changing over time. And how the underlying processes are changing over time. So that was like really like the core of my PhD thesis. And eventually I started to think about the idea that maybe diversity is not responding to environmental changes right away, right?
Yes.
And then
so if temperature changes, biodiversity doesn't change immediately.
Yeah,
after.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, but how do you know, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the key question here is, how do you know that if you don't see anything, it's not because there's nothing to see, but it's just because there's nothing to see yet?
Yes. Yeah.
And so yeah, then during my first postdoc, I didn't really have time to work on that, and it was not really like on the topic.
Yeah.
But I remember when I got the job interview for Dynacom, eventually, you always have like the person interviewing you is, well, do you have questions? Yeah. I was like, yes, I do. Actually, would you mind if we work on those questions that are slightly unrelated? So from the very beginning, I think Helmut knew that I wanted to work on that, and I think he was also really into the topic.
Yeah,
it's like pretty timely, right?
Yeah, he shows it in all of his talks. Yeah. He shows your figure with lag.
Oh yeah,
effect,
yeah. And so so we started to work on that. It's been a fairly long process. So we actually submitted once, and it got rejected. And then we, for good reasons, definitely improved the paper.
Yeah.
And so it required like a bunch of extra work, and so now we got it submitted. But it's not. I feel extinction depths are a very specific idea of how do you measure lag. So that's why we like now I try to not talk about it that much, but it's definitely a delay in response diversity, in the response of diversity, or a lag. But and so it's not related to Dynacom. We actually looked at freshwater fish in Europe, because now you have like this really nice and neat and kind of awesome database of freshwater time series.
Yeah, what's it called?
Reef Fish Time.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's been published, I think it was 2 years ago now, so in 2020. I don't remember.
Okay. But it's constantly updated since then, or?
I actually don't know.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
It's not like the biotime where you have a lot of But the biotime is, because I think the source, the different sources is way more diverse in terms of data. It's a little bit more messy when you get it like the raw thing, and so it takes way more time. Yeah. And since I feel like a little bit more comfortable with freshwater fish, just because my PhD was about freshwater fish, so I know where to find the data, and so I thought, well, we're just gonna go for that, because I know where to find things. Yeah. And so so we try to see, well, is what we're observing, because we know that a bunch of species are going extinct in general, and so you would expect to see a global loss of which we do in some extent. But if you look at species richness trends, so just the number of species across the world, you have a lot of studies showing that on average the number of species is increasing. Yeah, exactly. So you have this kind of discrepancy between like what you see at the species level and what you see at the community level. And so there are a bunch of different explanations, but one of them is that actually it takes time to the community to respond to the environmental change. Yeah. And so that's this idea of delay. Yeah. So we wanted to see if those delays are that common, if it could be an actual explanation, and how do you measure them? And the measuring part is kind of boring in some extent, a little bit more technical, but they are actually fairly common. And so what we found is that, you know, you would expect that if the environment is not changing, the diversity is not changing. Yeah. But long story short, what we found is that, yes, it should increase a little bit. Even if nothing is changing, because your communities are not at the equilibrium yet with their environment, you still have some room to increase the number of species at a local community. Okay. So the baseline is an increase. And so what we found is we actually don't increase as much as we should. Yeah. Under, like, you know, if nothing was happening. Yeah. We didn't look yet at the environmental drivers that could be, you know, like resulting in this. Because the study was already quite a lot, and so we thought the drivers would be for another paper or something. But yeah, so we don't really know what are the actual driver. Because it's freshwater fish, it's probably temperature, because they're really sensitive to temperature. And it was a really global pattern. We saw that, yes, it's actually delayed pretty much everywhere.
By how long is it delayed for when it comes to river fish?
So, like, the way we did it cannot tell you exactly the year, the number of years. So that's also another thing, which for now is a little bit frustrating, because we know it's delayed. And I actually didn't look at that. I think it would be possible if I really compare it to the baseline, given the number of species richness trend. So you get kind of a number of species per year, right? Because it's the trend over time. And so I guess you can compare them and probably find like how much it's delayed by. Yeah. But we didn't look at that. We know also like there's this bias due to the time series length, right? And so because if you get a short time series, you have less data to estimate your trends, and so it might be a little bit more biased. What we found is actually, if your expectation was a trend equal to 0, you will, for at least for the reef fish data, the time series length minimum should be 40 years, which is, I mean, I know it's like already really hard to get like time series of 5 years or 10 years, right? And so 40 years, it's just on average the reef fish data are 20 years, which is already pretty good. Like from a statistical point of view, you can do a lot of things with that. And so, but you know, then you have to say, well, actually we need 40 years now, guys. And plus, like, there's no way you can go back in time anyway. Yeah, so it's you have to wait for 20 extra years, knowing that it's actually going pretty bad. So you don't really have those 20 years to wait. So yeah.
So yeah, right now, maybe summing all of this up and where this sits. Right now, there's a lot of voices in the scientific community to like come up with, or even in the policy sphere, to come up with a policy target similar for biodiversity, similar to the climate target, like 2 degrees or 1.5. And now knowing all this, and that there is, even if you, like, biodiversity has many layers, and it's not like climate change where you have temperature as the one big driver in global warming. If you now were to say, okay, we limit temperature to the 2 degree target, and then biodiversity will also improve, there's this lag effect that you now talk about, right? Yeah. So, and you don't, first of all, we know there is a lag effect. We don't know how long it is, though. And we don't know what the response in biodiversity will be maybe 40 years later. So
yeah, and it's probably actually way longer. I mean, there are a bunch of studies looking at the effect of the past glacial maximum on what we see today, right? Which means that you can have lags of like 21,000 years.
Yeah, okay.
So, you know, then we were talking about, well, what are we going to do for like 2030? It's like, guys, like, but so, yeah, no, it changes this, I guess, like, the framework. It should, like, you know, it doesn't make sense to say, well, if we improve by 2 degrees now, then biodiversity is going to be fine. Yeah. And that's it. We're done. Problem solved. Exactly. It makes the problem, I think, a more complicated and
sure.
a little bit more nuanced too,
Yeah.
because it's not a binary thing.
Exactly.
Which I guess it comes down to that, like, but also this binary aspect. And in conservation, ecology, or biology, usually you have this kind of, like my feeling, and I'm not a specialist, but it is usually a binary point of view, but also because it's...
For sure, yeah.
It's you have to do it this way in some extent, because it's like either you act on a system or you don't, and this is binary. And so how do you match that with what we were saying as ecologists? Well, it depends, right? Like that's our big thing. We don't want to be binary or just like give a threshold, because for us it actually doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
But on the other side, eventually that's a binary thing. So I feel like there's this translation in the two world that is really, really hard.
Yeah.
This like study on biodiversity delays, it's not helping in translating. I mean, it's a part of the story. Yeah. But it's not helping in having those like clear targets. Quite the opposite, because in top of saying, well, having a specific target, it doesn't really make sense because of thresholds, and you and Helmut have been working on that. But it's, well, what you're basing your thresholds on is actually not relevant because of those delays. So,
exactly, yeah. So it's like the one of the common assumptions is always that if we tackle climate change, we are also going to tackle the biodiversity crisis. But your study now shows that this is probably not the case.
Yeah. And I mean, and you also have like a bunch of literature saying it's not only about climate change, right? So you have climate change, you have pollution, you have urbanization, you have non-native species, you have all those different factors that usually act together. Like you have like those synergies between the stressors. And so it's climate change. Yeah, it actually, we do need to solve it, definitely. But that's not the only problem.
Yeah, but biodiversity isn't a tag-along to climate change.
Yeah, it's not like a one-to-one relation.
Exactly,
So no, that's definitely...
Perfect. That's perfect context. Thank you very much for that. Wait, so, and it's, you said it's submitted in... in Nature,
Ecology and Evolution.
Yeah.
We submitted this in September, basically. Okay. So now it's under review. Yeah. We don't have to think about it for a little bit, which is good. And now, it's kind of terrible because I gave a few talks on that, and so people have feedback. Yeah. And then I'm like, oh, that's a good point. Actually, we didn't think about that. And so, it's more in the technical aspect, but it's like, well, now there's nothing I can do. It's under review, and now I have it in my mind. But if the reviewers don't point that out, maybe I should still change it, because it's actually a really good point, but also I'm adding myself like some work. So
maybe they will.
Hopefully.
Okay.
Like somehow, for once, I really hope the reviewers will have like a really exhaustive things to criticize. Anyway.
Okay, keep your eyes peeled for this Extinction Debt project coming out in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully.
Cool.
Ish.
Yeah. And now let's get into you as a person, as an academic. So you are like versed in community ecology, temporal dynamics of diversity, global change.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good summary.
Yeah. And shaping diversity across scale, processes shaping diversity across scales. It says on your CV.
Yeah.
I love that. That's a cool one. And this journey started for you in Bordeaux?
So it was my undergrad that I did in Bordeaux in France, which that's the moment where I started. So, and I don't know how it is in Germany, but in France, usually the first 2 years of the undergrad are fairly general. So it's like biology. Okay. You might have one class that is ecology, but it's really broad ecology, right? Like you're learning what is an ecosystem and stuff like that. But then the third year is when you can specialize a little bit. And so that's...
wow, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what it's like in Germany. I did my bachelor's in Australia.
Yeah.
But so that's why you then have the title Bachelor of Science Ecology, or the degree, or...
So I think if I had to do it in English, I don't know. Oh, and I guess it's in English actually.
Yeah.
My CV.
Yeah. I couldn't read it otherwise.
Didn't think about that. But yeah, so it's exactly. You say ecology because of the last year that gives you this kind of specialty. I mean, it's still an undergrad, but yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And then so that's when you got. Or when did you get caught by or bitten by the biology bug?
Well, it was kind of funny. So it's like after high school, you have to choose what you're gonna do with the rest of your life. That's why your parents tell you usually, which is a little bit overwhelming. And it was always like, oh, I want to do this. So at some point, I was really into chemistry, which would have been terrible for me, but back then I didn't really realize that. I also really was into being a journalist. And then my mom told me, well, since you're a kid, you're so into animals. Why don't you keep going with that? Because, you were like 3 years old and what you wanted to like have it was like animal, like, those books like telling you the tiger is in the jungle. And like, and also like all those like wildlife documentaries on the TV. And so she was like, well, just keep going with that. Like you'll change it later if you don't like it, but it's something you've been into your entire life and it seems like pretty consistent over time. So probably it's going to stay the same way. And so she was actually right.
She was.
And so, Bordeaux was the moment where it got a little bit more... not serious, but like a little bit more academic, let's put it this way. But still, really liked it. Are
you from Bordeaux?
No, I moved quite a lot. So I was born not that far from, not that close either, but a little bit south to Paris in Orléans.
Okay.
And then moved to La Rochelle, which is on the west coast. Which is probably the best city in the world. And I feel like it's definitely worth mentioning.
I need to check it out. La Rochelle?
La Rochelle, yeah.
Okay.
It's like 2 words. But it's actually a really, really nice city. The food is really nice. And but then we moved to Bordeaux, where the food is also nice, but the wine is even better.
Yes.
It's actually known for that. And then moved to Toulouse.
Sweet. Yeah, exactly. Masters, then in Toulouse.
Yeah, so the master... so again, not really sure how it is in the rest of the world, but in France, so usually the first year of the master, again, is fairly general, but in ecology, not in biology this time, right? It's a little bit more specific. And then the second year, you get your specialty. The specialty I wanted to get was in Toulouse, and it was something really more about theories in ecology. So I don't remember the exact... name of the master, but I think it was something like ecology and evolution. And so it was like this really broad topic where you're getting really into those big theories we have in ecology and evolution. It was really in the title actually. And then eventually during my first year, I had this class that everyone hated so badly, which was called population dynamics, and it's all those really like mathematic heavy classes where you have like to calculate the Jacobian matrix and stuff like, and I was so into it. And I was the only one being that into it. And so in Toulouse, they also have another master specialty, which is the one I did, which is the modeling one.
Yeah.
And so, which has this kind of like math and coding aspect that the other one doesn't really have, which... and it has its advantages and inconvenience, I guess. But eventually that's what I did.
What did you like about community or population dynamics?
Well, it was just like the math part, which I always kind of liked it, but then like during high school I kind of dropped it, and so I started to be pretty bad at it. I didn't really like it anymore.
Same.
But then it was fairly easy. It's really logical actually, and so I don't know. I really like this like logical thing, and that was it. And it was fairly straightforward. Also, I thought, and I remember thinking I don't understand what is the link between, again, like for instance, a Jacobian matrix and actual ecology, right? Like if you go to the field, like how do you relate those two?
Yeah.
My takeaway a few years later is sometimes you can't. It's like two different worlds, two different frameworks, and that's fine.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to force it. So, but back then I remember I was a little bit frustrating about that.
Yeah. Okay.
But then in the modeling part, like and especially like my master was a little bit like biased towards statistics, not that much like really mechanistic modeling.
Yeah.
And so statistics are usually based on empirical data. So that's also where you start to link back those like, you know, math in a really broad way and what you see on the field, even though I don't go on the field. So I don't see anything, but you know.
Yeah, you work with existing data like that river fish time database.
Yeah, exactly. So since so my master project was actually mechanistic modeling. So we just created our data, but then the first year, but then the second year it was on fish phenology. So when do they migrate?
Yeah, river fish again, right?
Yeah. It was really, and I'm not a fish person, but it's just like it happened to be during all my projects I've been working on fish. And so so those ones were data that were already available. It was time series from the 60s, right? Like daily. They were actually amazing. It was like daily time series since the 60s.
From France.
From France. It was just 4 sites. But then we could get really like when do the fish are migrating.
Sweet.
And it's actually pretty cool because it was in at dams on the rivers. And so they would have a camera that would like counts the fish and identify them too. So it would be all automatic somehow.
Oh shit!
And
nice.
so obviously it was not like that in the 60s.
Yeah.
But like the more recent time series we had, it was actually basically machine learning, like doing like the work. And so sometimes you would have to double check because depending on how the fish goes in front of the camera, you know, if it's a little bit like not really straight, then like it's a little bit harder. But so the data were actually really cool. And then during my PhD, it was something pretty much like the Refish time database.
Yeah, PhD. Still in Toulouse.
Still in Toulouse, actually, stay in Toulouse. The food is also really good. The wine is also pretty good.
So from La Rochelle, great food, to great wine in Bordeaux, and then to great food again in Toulouse.
Yeah, great food, great beer also. Like the beers is not too bad, even though I tend to say in France we have like not the best food, but we definitely have really, really good food, better than here. We have better wine, but when it comes to beers, I actually acknowledge that Germans might be better than us.
Okay,
you know.
At least something.
And I do like beer, so it actually matters. So Toulouse. Eventually stayed for my PhD. So after my master project, my master advisor told me, well, if you want to, you could work on this project. So then you have this kind of exam, like you have to get into the PhD.
Like a honors in Britain, or
I actually have no idea.
Okay.
So it's not even an exam. It's really like you apply. So there are different ways to get your PhD funded in France, but the one I did is the most like common, I would say. So it's like through the Ministry of Research and Higher Education or something like that.
Okay.
I think.
Fancy.
And so they have for each university a given number of PhDs they are going to fund, and so you have to apply.
Right.
So it's based on your grades during your master and your master project, I guess. And I mean, it's based on your grades, and then you have this talk, which is it's a little bit intense when you're just finishing up your master because it's like 15 minutes and it has to be 12 minutes on your master project and then 3 minutes on your PhD project. So it's something super unbalanced.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to explain to a bunch of people. And so the entire committee, usually there are only 2 people in it who can understand what you're doing, because it's basically for the all biology part of the university, right? So you have like people being vet or people doing cell biology, but they're still part of the committee who's going to evaluate you. And I think we had 2 or 3 ecologists who are not all community ecologists, right? So that's actually kind of a weird experience when you're like a master's student and you don't necessarily feel super relevant, right? And you might have this like fairly strong imposter syndrome, and you arrive and you have like those 20 people in front of you, and you like have 15 minutes and that's it, and 3 minutes to explain them what I'm gonna do, which in 3 minutes it's not a lot.
No,
basically.
no, we've been talking for 34 minutes.
Well,
yep.
And I didn't tell you what my PhD was about.
No, exactly. What was the PhD about?
River
fish again?
Yeah. So it was about how river fish diversity changing over time. So, I mean, it had a lot of side projects eventually, and which eventually we decided to have in the PhD thesis because it made sense. But so one part of it was first to describe diversity of freshwater fish in France and in Europe, but just from a spatial perspective.
Okay.
So, like this place is hotter, and so you have less of those fish, but also having the functional and phylogenetic diversity. So what are the traits? Do we have non-native species? And what are the drivers? So it was really like the first part, which is, I would say, really classic ecology. And so the second part was more about how diversity is changing. So those functions and those this phylogenetic diversity, how is it changing over time? And then the final part was how do the processes underlying those diversity patterns are changing over time. So usually we stick to the patterns, and here we really wanted to look at the processes, which are also the assembly rules. So we focused on environmental filtering, which is like the pressure the environment is, not the pressure, but like how the environment is shaping your community. And so if you have a really harsh environment, species have to adjust to that, and they're just going to be so similar because that's the only way they could survive in this environment. But on the other hand, you have also competition, that if you're too similar, you're going to use the same resources. And then there's not enough resources for everyone. And so how this balance between those two processes is changing over time. That's what we were looking at for freshwater fish in France. And so...
Nice.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
And that's what got you into this? Oh, no, there's a postdoc in between. Sorry.
And then I went for a postdoc in the US, which was a slightly different topic, and which was really cool. So it was community ecology and macroecology. So it was at large scale, and it was not with freshwater fish.
For once.
It was with amphibians. So it was, the project was a mix of community ecology, macroecology, and phylogeography. Which
what is that?
Which it took me a while to actually figure it out. I'm not sure. I'm gonna give a really good definition, but my understanding of phylogeography is understanding the spatial patterns in genetic diversity within a species, which can tell you basically what happened to this species, right? So it gives you an idea if you had different populations that have been isolated for a long time, and then you have a secondary contact, right? All those within species dynamics, you can actually tell from the genetic structure of the different populations. So that was also a big new thing. And when I applied for this job, I mean, you see like the ad and it's macroecology, and you feel kind of okay about that, even though not that much, but kind of okay. And phylogeography, and you're like, I have no idea what it is. It sounds cool, but I just don't know anything about it. And so I remember when I got interviewed by Katie, who was my advisor, I was like, but I'm actually not a phylogeographer. And she said something pretty awesome. She was like, oh yeah, and I'm not a macroecologist, so you're gonna be the macroecologist on this project, and I'm gonna be the phytogeographer, and we're gonna work as a team. And I thought it was super cool because
Sweet,
it's like it's your first postdoc, and you don't necessarily feel super relevant or legitimate, and it's like, well, we're actually teammates, and you're like, oh, okay, then I'm into that. So it was actually one of the reasons I went for this postdoc, and because I also thought I get to choose in some extent what I was going to work on, and I still wanted to learn about new things, and so phylogeography was one of them. Not that I always dream of learning and knowing phylogeography, but I just wanted to not stay in this like community ecology, like really classical community ecology. I wanted to learn new things, and I feel like that's probably something you can do your entire career, but it was like a really active step towards that.
Nice.
Basically for this postdoc, So.
Well done. In Oklahoma, you went to Oklahoma in 2018.
Sorry. I went. I feel like that's it. I went to Oklahoma in 2018. It was the first time I actually went abroad.
Yeah, I was gonna say yes.
Which it's you going from a fairly big city in France, Toulouse, and you're arriving in this crazy world that is Oklahoma, and especially Norman, Oklahoma. So Oklahoma, the capital is Oklahoma City, which already tells a lot about the state. But and it's basically the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. Okay.
Which at first, I mean, I didn't think about it that much at the beginning. I was just like, well, I found a postdoc, which I feel like usually you feel fairly lucky about, and so you're like, well, no, that's fine. I got a postdoc.
Yeah.
It was the middle of nowhere, but it gives you, I think, a slightly different experience than if you go to New York City or if you go to, California, where you have those big cities. It's a really different dynamics. And so where I was, it was a bunch of students who were not from Norman, Oklahoma, because pretty much no one is from Norman, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And so it was also like everyone was really trying to create and build this community because we are all in this together, and we know we are not going to spend the rest of our lives here, and so in the meantime we should take care of each other. So it was actually really welcoming. Nice. Which it was actually pretty cool. I'm still in touch with some of the people from there, and so
sweet.
Actually I wouldn't spend the rest of my life there, but I feel like it was a good experience. Going back at it.
Excellent. And then it took you to Oldenburg in 2020.
Yeah, which is another experience. Weather-wise, we got tornadoes in Oklahoma, and here we just have bad weather.
Here we just have rain.
And so Germany. I don't know. Germany felt always a little bit exotic to me for some reason, not in a tropical way, but just like so different. and the more, and I don't really know what it is exactly about Germany that makes me feel this way, but since forever. And then eventually I arrived in Germany. I was like, oh yeah, I really think it, like, I don't know, there is like something, and I have still a hard time to point like what is exactly this about, but it's just, I don't know, I don't know. I don't have this feeling with Spain or with England or Germany. Is just like
different.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say strange, but strange wouldn't be a good word. It's not in a good or in a bad way. It's just like different, but more different than I would expect, I guess. And maybe that's why I'm so like, aware of it. But Oldenburg. It actually started in Wilhelmshaven.
Yes, you did. Oh yes, I forgot about this.
Where my actual office is. Even though I probably don't have the key to my own office in Wilhelmshaven, and I'm pretty sure I don't have the key to enter the building anymore.
So the ICBM is split between Oldenburg and Wilhelmshaven. Yes.
But and don't they have also a part in Bremerhaven?
Oh, in Bremerhaven? Maybe. I didn't even know.
I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
Might be.
It's a big institute.
So they have like a actually a pretty nice building in Wilhelmshaven. And sometimes when you go to work, you see, I don't know if there are sea lions or something, but it definitely happened to me.
Seals, yeah.
Oh, yeah, seals. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which, it's also like, I mean, it wouldn't be the reason to move to Wilhelmshaven, but it's also like, it's cool. Yeah. It happens every once in a while, and you just go to the office and you see a seal, which, not everyone gets to say that. Yeah. But anyway, so first it was Wilhelmshaven during a pandemic. Not speaking German.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, God, yes.
Which was a little bit intense. Definitely the first month were a little bit harsh.
Especially in the rainy north of Germany.
Yeah.
In the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things when I came back to Europe was also, well, I want to be closer to France, where my friends and my family are. And then you are fairly close, but there's a pandemic. Yeah. And so it's just like, well, that's not what I planned, really. Like, I really want to see, like, the people I care about. And so that was a little bit, the beginning was a little bit harsh. And then moved to Oldenburg. And, I feel like now I'm getting used to it.
Yeah,
nice.
And you've other than the scientific main part that we've talked about, you also you have a lot of experience with mentorship and teaching also, I've read.
Yeah. It's like you had my CV before.
I did, yeah. Like for instance, Charlene Fechter, who was on the podcast, I think in episode 7 or something. You supervised her.
Yeah.
On the project.
Yeah. So eventually, she didn't do her thesis really on the project. So she worked on it a little bit, which I think was really challenging for her because it was a coding project, and she never ever coded before.
Yeah, okay, right.
And so we had like this kind of super intensive org classes.
Yeah.
So I think it was like for 2 weeks, or I don't know, don't really remember, but where it was really, really intense. And it's like always, I've been spending the last few years coding with R. So for me, it's really straightforward. Like, just remove this row. And I go, you just do that, this, and that, and end of the story.
Yeah.
And you have to remember that it's actually a process, and you actually learn all of that. And so it's sometimes I tend to forget it is a process. I've been mentoring some people also in the US.
PhDs as well, or
no? So I at some point, especially with this paper we talked about at the beginning.
The extinction debt.
On the likes and stuff. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to do was to get fundings to get a PhD student to work on follow-ups on that, because then, for now it's just species richness, but you could include functional traits, you could include the drivers, you could look at biodiversity, you could look at... So there are a bunch of things you can do with that.
Yeah.
And I just don't have the time, because actually Dynacom is hiring me not to work on this project, but to work on their project, which is like normal and fair and expected. But so at some point I started to think about trying to find money for a potential PhD student. And it is actually a nightmare to find money to fund a PhD student when you're a postdoc, which I guess makes sense because you're not in a permanent position. And so it's who's gonna actually handle the money and so on. Like I guess from the admin perspective, it's kind of a nightmare for a postdoc to be in charge, like with the admin part. But so never got a PhD student. But I don't know if I'm really ready to get a PhD student. Like,
So if you're not ready, then I am definitely not ready.
Are you getting a PhD student?
No, no, not yet. And not now knowing how hard it is.
I mean, I feel like, I don't know. I feel like I've heard stories where some people eventually hate academia because their PhD experience was terrible.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
And sometimes it comes down to not that much, like bad communication with the advisor, it's not like a crazy thing happened, right? And so it's like, well, I don't feel like I can take the responsibility of that for some reason, and And I know that sometimes I'm also a little bit cynical. I'm like, well, I don't know. It's just like, I'm not sure. Like,
maybe you'll grow into it. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I mean, we'll see. I mean, and I think it would be fun in some extent, but maybe waiting a little bit.
And do you you've also done some lecturing and graduate and undergraduate assistants in different courses? Do you enjoy that, or what's the experience there?
So it was mostly during my PhD, and the not that fun part is the first classes I've been teaching, I never had them as a student. Mm-hmm. And so it was really things that I didn't really know about. The first, oh my gosh, my first lecture was the worst ever in the world. So it was not a lecture. It was I don't know how you call them, like the practicals.
The tutoring, practical tutoring.
Yeah, maybe? When it's basically it's not like the entire class. It's just 30 students at a time.
Yeah.
And so you have to give so it was an hour and a half, and you have to give, I think it was 45 minutes of a talk about and then they had jars with different animals in it, right? And they would look at them and observe them and ask you questions. Mm-hmm. And so that was basically the entire semester was it was the animal biology or zoology, whatever. Mm-hmm. And so it would start at 7:45 in the morning, which just it's basically 8, but it's just it starts with a 7, and you're like, oh, I'm not ready. It's way too early. And then mine was actually on parasites and human parasites. Oh. So it's 7:45. It's your first class. You're super anxious. Those people are they basically were 1 or 2 years younger than me.
Yeah.
So you definitely feel you shouldn't be the teacher more than they should, right? So it doesn't make sense. And then you have all these parasites, and you have to show those awful pictures, and you're like, what am I doing? No, that's not okay. It feels so off. So yeah, that was my first teaching experience.
Wonderful.
Didn't enjoy it that much somehow.
Didn't sound like it.
And then I had to do it again the same day, but in the afternoon, which was slightly better, I guess.
Okay.
But so those classes were actually not that fun. I mean, and they're really, they have to learn a bunch of things by heart, and that's not really interesting actually by itself, I feel.
Yeah.
But then one class I really, really enjoyed teaching was the OR class.
Statistics.
And statistics. Yeah. So, which is a little bit challenging also, because usually you have students who went in the biology thing because they didn't want to do math. They didn't want to do any coding whatsoever. And so biology, but they still had this scientific way. And so biology was the kind of easiest usually. And so you arrive and you're like, well, today we're going to code and we're going to do statistics. And so usually they're kind of no, not really. So that's, that's a little bit more challenging.
Yeah.
But also because I know my way around, and I it goes eventually it goes fairly well if you find those small tricks that you get the students really into. So the super easy one is I remember when I told them they could change the colors of the dots when they're plotting things. And I was like, well, if you type on Google our color, you go for the first PDF, and here are all the colors you can get. Yeah. And they were so into it. Everyone started to really enjoy it and be like, oh, actually we can do that and that. And I was like, yeah. And at first, you call your models model 1, model 2, and so on. I was like, well, actually, it's just a name. Just call it unicorn if you want to. And they were like, oh, we can do that? And you're like, yeah, you can do that. And so then you start to see them getting really into it and not being scared or annoyed about it. And so it's actually pretty also fun. And fairly rewarding too. And so. It was a class that I actually really enjoyed teaching.
Nice.
Kind of missed that. But yeah.
So with all that, what's next for you? What do you think?
I don't know. So I had I wouldn't say life crisis, but kind of a few months ago.
Yeah.
Didn't see that coming.
No.
But I'm actually pretty positive about it. But it was just the big question was, do I want to stay and stick to academia? And I feel for me, from the very beginning, the end goal was to get, a permanent position, professorship whatsoever. And that was it. And then the more it goes, the more I'm like, well, there are other things than being a professor, which is cool. But also, I feel a lot of people I've talked to are saying, well, you know, this imposter syndrome you're having now, it actually sticks to you for your entire career. Don't think it's, you know, and also, you think you don't have time to write your papers. Wait to be a permanent, in a permanent position, because then you will have to get fundings and you will have to advise people, and then you won't do as much research as you're doing now. And you're like, but I already don't have time. So like, no. And so I do like the job, but and it's also all this kind of pressure to publish that I'm too lazy, and so it doesn't work on me. I'm like, well, you know, if I don't want to work, like, leave me alone. I know some people are really able to push through it and just like work all the time and on weekends but no, I think it's actually a good thing that I'm lazy, because I definitely won't go through a burnout because of this, but it's still like, I can still feel it, right? So I feel like those last few years, I was not super motivated, and so it was hard for me to get papers out as a first author, which I feel like by me, it's actually all right. Like, I'm fine with it. Yeah. But then on my CV, if I apply to a job, it's like, well, what happened for the last 5 years? And you can play the pandemic a little bit, right? Like, you can always go this way, but it's like, well, yeah, but from my first postdoc, I still didn't get my paper out, which is for other reasons. But, you know, and even this postdoc, the paper we talked about at the beginning is like my first paper, even though I arrived in 2020. So, okay, there was a pandemic, but, you know. Yeah.
But, I mean, you have a lot in prep. There's, like, billions of papers that you have in prep.
which is kind of my problem. And also, I mean, I've been also involved in other papers, right, where I'm not a first author. Yeah. And, I do have all those papers in prep. And that's one of my problem. I think Helmut actually was kind of really helpful with that, like saying, well, no, you stop with all those things in parallel. Like, you focus on this one when I arrived here. Because when I arrived here in the Dynacom project, I was like, oh, we could work on that, and that. And he was like, oh, yeah, we could. Yeah. But at some point, like, there are some priority, and you need to pick one and stick to that. And we'll see about the other ones. And so now I'm a little bit better at it. But so all of that, you know, again, I don't feel bad about not publishing. So, which is good, I guess, in some extent. Yes. But on my CV, it's still there, or not there, actually. And so I'm like, do I really want to try to catch up to get all those papers that some people who are my age, I mean, I know some people who are like, not my age, like academic age, let's say, they got fundings from the equivalent of the DFG. They several times they got like papers in like crazy journals. I mean, I'm competing with those people for jobs. Yeah. There's literally no way I'm actually be able to get a job if they are there. And I mean, it's good for them, but it's like, well, you know, academia is not the only way. And it took me a really long time to be okay with this idea that it's not failure to just like drop academia. And I feel like academia is really resentful. Once you live it, it's actually really hard to come back, right? Like, and so some of my friends were like, oh, but just like, take a break from academia and come back after. You're like, no, that's not how it works. So I think that's why a lot of people are waiting the very last moment and like, you know, the burnout moment to leave, because once you leave and that's it. There is no coming back from that. Right. Okay. And so I was like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you leave academia, it was my plan. There was no plan B. There was plan academia. Like, and now I'm a little bit more, well, it's actually fine to not stick to academia. Most people are not in academia. They're pretty happy. Yeah. And, you know, so like right now it's kind of, I'm still like trying to figure it out, to be honest. And it's definitely a process. I'm lucky enough that I have the time at least until this phase of Dynacom is done, right? Which is until like 2025. Yeah. So it's still like a little bit more than 2 years. Yeah. And so it's actually pretty good because I have time to figure out what I want to do, what I need to do to get that. And I still have this, you know, from like a material perspective. Like I'm not worried, like I'm not going to be able to pay my rent or something, right? So I still have the time to figure that out. Yeah. long story short, I don't think I want to keep going with the postdocs. It's a fun thing, and I really loved my 2 experiences as a postdoc. It was really different, and I've learned a lot of things from that.
Definitely,
yeah.
Good skill set.
Yeah. But yeah, there are other things, and again, like now I'm like, oh, I actually want to go back to France, and I don't really want to, move around for my job all the time, which is also like something we're asking
academics
to the postdocs to do, and you're like, well, is this job is actually worth like all of that? It's I mean, and it can be, which is definitely fine, but I feel like for me, I'm at this moment where I'm like, I don't think it is actually.
No, it's super helpful that you're voicing this. Like, it's not often heard, this side of academia, and that you have such a I would say objective view on academia of the job you're in is helpful to hear for others, I think, as well.
Yeah, and I feel like for me, what really took me a long time is to come at peace with the idea that not being a professor, it's actually not failure. Yeah. It's fine.
Exactly.
It's more than fine. But it's just like, since during your PhD, it's like, oh, did you get a postdoc already at the end? And so it's just like assuming you're going to go for a postdoc, and then like, oh, do you find your next postdoc? Are you applying for grants? Are you getting your papers out and stuff? And it's all like everything going towards this idea you have to get a permanent position, even though we know not everyone will get one. It's just like, we have more and more PhD students, which I think is amazing and great, but the number of positions is not keeping up with that. So obviously you're increasing the number of PhD students, potentially postdocs.
Yeah.
But then you don't have the positions for them. So it's like, well, actually it's not just I mean, if it's a failure, it's not from our side at all. It's just governments and institutions not like, being helpful to and supportive of their community, actually. And
very true.
Yeah. But yeah, it's definitely kind of a process to again come at peace with this idea of, well, academia might not be the plan A anymore, and it's fine.
Exactly. It's fine.
And so I remember actually during a workshop when I was in the US, which was about how do you leave academia. It was not phrased this way. It was way better. But basically that was kind of the idea. And there was this woman, and she was telling us, well, you've learned so much during your PhD. It was mostly for PhD students. You've learned so many skills and soft, like your actual skills, but soft skills you have no idea of. And so she, like, one of the tasks was to pick one of the things we do kind of on a daily basis, not daily, but like, so for instance, like writing a paper, running an experiment, going to a conference, preparing a talk, advising someone, all of that, or mentoring. So if you take a paper, so she was like, oh, so what do you need to do first? And you would have to do the list of all the things, because you don't write a paper in an hour, right? As good as you can be, like, it takes a while. So first you have to read papers, you have to frame your paper, then you actually have to write it in a proper way, and so on. And she was like, well, so, it's about being able to make, first of all, to find information, then to make this synthesis about what has been done before. How do you put your own research in that? And so it's like all those soft skills, which I feel like before, it's kind of obvious now that I know it, but before she said it, I was like, oh, actually, that's true. And it's a lot of skills.
Yeah.
And it's the same with coding. Oh, you don't know how to do something. Well, you still know how to look for it.
Exactly.
Which is actually an amazing skill. If you go to a company, I'm pretty sure if you say, well, yeah, that's true, I actually don't know how to do it, but I've been spending the last 3 years learning how to learn and where to find the information I need.
Exactly.
It's actually like a crazy skill. And because in academia it's assumed that we all know how to do that, we just pretend it's like normal, but it's just amazing. And at some point I feel like we should say it again. And so as a PhD student, as a postdoc, you're learning all of that. And I thought it was a really, really good workshop to just be aware of it and a little bit more like, oh, actually, I'm not doing that bad.
Great.
It was actually like a good thing. But yeah, and then you're like, she was saying all the skills, once you are really aware of them, you should like, kind of sell yourself based on that, because it's actually really valuable outside of academia.
Exactly.
And because we're just like trained to think it's only about academia, we don't really realize what's valuable outside of academia.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a pretty cool workshop because of that. Yeah.
And that you're saying it now is even more valuable. Yeah. I feel like, thank you very much for this.
But yeah. So, I don't know. We'll see if it's academia or not. Probably not, but
more power to you if it's not.
Yeah.
It's fine.
We'll see. Yeah. But,
Cool. So with that, we're at the end. Is there anything that we've missed that you want to say, that you want to add?
No, I think we covered it all. We said like French wine was the best one, that La Rochelle was the best city, and academia is not like the only way. So perfect. I feel like it's like the three big takeaways.
Yeah, the three main takeaways.
I would say that's that. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lucie.
Thank you, Jan.
And see you all later.
Want to dive deeper? Surf over to hifmb.de or follow us on Twitter at hifmb_OL.